All right. As this one was, last one was recording. Been listening to a lot of NF. I don't know if you guys have heard that rapper before, but he's got some pretty good lyrics. And encourage you guys to check him out. NF. It's clean too, so you can even listen at school and you won't get in trouble. Okay, but I did give you permission to listen to it at school. All right, here we go. Lesson 5. This is a big section. So I'm going to get going. I have to kind of read fast, just to let you know. Lesson 5, Challenge and Change in the 1950s. Word is nuclear war. Say nuclear war. War that uses atomic weapons. Economy, family type. There's a bomb shelter. Don't they look happy in their bomb shelter? Accusation, a charge of wrongdoing. Say accusation. Reputation. Say reputation. How a person is judged by others. You know, your rep. McCarthyism. Say McCarthyism. An attempt to gain power by attacking the patriotism of others. McCarthyism. What was McCarthyism? That's a question there. How did the civil rights movement begin? Excuse me. There's a picture of Rosa Parks. If you don't know her story, maybe watch a YouTube video on her and we'll read a little bit about her. Next one, National Guard. Say National Guard. It's the state's military force. Martin Luther King Jr. What was like in the 1950s? Automation. Say automation. The use of machines to do work. And most television programs are black and white in the 1950s. All right. How was Eisenhower reelected? How did the space race begin? And next word is artificial satellite. Say artificial satellite. Object made by humans that travels in outer space and sends signals back to Earth. I told you it's a big section. In fact, I think they really should have divided this into two, but I didn't write the textbook. All right, here we go. The Republicans argued that the Democratic Party had become filled with corruption. They claimed that the Truman administration had handled the Korean War badly. It is time for a change, the Republicans said. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Republican candidate, was elected president in 1952. He won in a landslide victory over Adlai Stevenson. Known as Ike, Eisenhower was a hero of World War II. He took office in 1953 and became a popular president. The nation's economy was doing well during most of the years Eisenhower held office. Soldiers who had returned from fighting in World War II and Korea had started families. New home construction soared, as did the need for more and better American products. During this time, the lives of most Americans improved. The fear of communism and the Soviet Union still exists. The Soviet Union developed an atomic bomb. Americans were worried about a war using atomic weapons or nuclear war. People built bomb shelters in their backyards. Cities set up air raid warning signals. School children were taught to get under their desks to go to a certain place quickly when they heard air raid silence. Here you can see the bomb shelter in the picture. It says this family model bomb shelter shows an escape opening at the top and an entrance that attached to a cellar. This kind of shelter was placed underground. What was McCarthyism? In 1947, President Truman and other political leaders feared that communists were working within the United States government. Truman issued an order creating a loyalty security program for federal employees. During the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, nearly 7,000 federal workers suspected of being security risks were either fired or forced to resign. Americans feared communism, and Senator Joseph McCarthy used this fear to his own political gain. He kept saying that traitors were trying to destroy the country. McCarthy became one of the most feared members of the Senate. Many American educators, journalists, and entertainers lost their jobs as a result of his accusations. Others had their reputations ruined. For a long time, few politicians were willing to challenge McCarthy. McCarthy began to investigate Army officials. The Senate held televised hearings for 36 days in 1954. When television audiences saw McCarthy as a lying bully, they demanded an investigation. A special Senate committee found that most of McCarthy's charges were untrue. With the help of television, the American people were able to take away much of McCarthy's power. The campaign he used to make his accusations soon became known as McCarthyism. Okay, if you've ever heard of something called like a witch hunt, so the Salem witch trials, so they're accusing people with not really much evidence, that starts there. This is also considered a witch hunt. Um, so they didn't really have evidence to prove that we had communists within our government, or certainly not in the army. When it got to that point of accusing people in the army, people were like, really? Like, yeah. So he used it to make himself look good, put others down. I hope that we don't do that as humans, but sometimes we do that. How did the civil rights movement begin? African Americans had fought for democracy in two world wars. Yet when they returned from those wars, they were still denied basic political and social rights. In the 1950s, many African Americans decided that the members of their race could no longer be victims. The civil rights movement was sparked by a 1954 decision of the Supreme Court, Brown v. the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. A young African American girl was denied the right to attend a white school. Her father sued the school board. NAACP lawyers, so that stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Lawyers, including Thurgood Marshall, worked very hard on this case. Marshall later became the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court. In the decision, the Supreme Court ruled that separate schools for whites and Africans were unconstitutional. In 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that separate can never be equal. Local school boards were ordered to end school segregation. So, the Supreme Court has made some bad decisions. Finally, they made a good decision in 1954. And it just said that you cannot separate people by race. So that's what segregation was. Unconstitutional means it goes against the Constitution. So schools will then start the process of desegregation, which just means the process of putting everybody together, regardless of social or racial borders. Okay, here we go. In December 1955, Rosa Parks, a 42-year-old African American woman, got on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She found a seat near the middle of the bus. The bus driver asked Parks to give up her seat to a white person. Parks would not. Police were called and she was arrested. Parks had not planned to challenge the law on that day. Parks said, "I felt it was just something that I had to do." Her decision not to move from her seat on a bus was the quiet beginning of the national civil rights movement. I'm going to hold off on credit cards. Going on. A 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. led a boycott of the buses in Montgomery in 1956. He helped to organize carpools to help African Americans travel around the city. He was arrested for his actions. 1 year later, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public transportation was unconstitutional. So schools had to mix, if you will, and now buses and public transportation now had to desegregate. Going on, King went on to become the most visible person in the civil rights movement. He urged his supporters to use nonviolent protests to gain equal rights. So, not hitting or fighting, but doing things that does not include that. His speeches moved many to action and drew attention to racial discrimination that affected African Americans. A new civil rights law was passed in August 1957. This law made it illegal to use force to stop someone from voting. This was the first civil rights law since Reconstruction. Progress was continually challenged. The governor of Arkansas tried to prevent 9 African American children from attending an all white school in Little Rock. The state's National Guard was ordered to protect the school. A National Guard is a state's military force. President Eisenhower sent federal troops to help the African American children. The governor finally backed down. And I've got more on that in my presentation with videos and that, okay? What was life like in the 1950s? American society experienced many changes in the 1950s. Jobs were available for most Americans. With the development of automation, factories employed thousands of people to produce countless new products. Advances in science and technology offered Americans better health and a higher standard of living than ever before. The family and the home became popular symbols of American life. The image of women as housewives and husbands as breadwinners were commonly found in magazine advertising and TV commercials. In the late 1950s, many middle class families had both husbands and wives working outside the home. Most women did not hold career jobs like their husbands. In general, jobs held by married women were seen as temporary until children arrived. But unlike their mothers, many women thought that being a homemaker or a temporary employee was not their only choice. Women began to question the narrow role assigned to them in society. Early in the 1960s, the first steps of the women's movement were taken. The purpose of the women's movement was to seek social and economic equality for American women. Most television programs were black and white in the 1950s. You can see them gathering around the TV. And look at that wallpaper. Going on. In 1956, the federal government started a huge program to build interstate highways. The highways would connect most cities with populations over 50,000. As the roads were built, suburbs attracted more home builders. New cars had large fins on their rear fenders. Some young people drove hot rods or cars that had been adjusted to go faster. Crew cuts were a common hairstyle for boys. Think of the movie Grease, if you've seen that. Girls wore their hair in ponytails. Television was only black and white. Young children watched a puppet named Howdy Doody and his friend Buffalo Bob. Rock and roll music was new, and young people loved it. The term UFO, unidentified flying object, entered the vocabulary of many Americans. How was Eisenhower reelected? In the election of 1956, Eisenhower was elected by an even greater landslide than in the previous election. The Democrats, however, took control of Congress. Although many Republicans consider the president to be too liberal, Americans seem to be happy with him. Going to go on. How did the space race begin? The United States was taken by surprise when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. Sputnik was an artificial satellite that traveled in outer space and sent radio signals back to Earth. Everyone was concerned that a foreign country knew how to do something that the Americans had not. The United States was developing space technology, but the Russians raced ahead. Sputnik 2, carrying a dog, was launched before the United States could get into space. A new battle had been added to the Cold War. On January 31st, 1958, the U.S. Army put the first American satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. This was 3 months after the launch of Sputnik 2. The following October, the United States created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. All right, I'll try to go over these. I got 2 minutes left for my video. How did Americans prepare for a nuclear war? Well, you might remember that they told kids to go under their desks. People bought bomb shelters and they had air raid sirens because what was going to happen? They were afraid that the Soviet Union was going to attack. Okay? What was McCarthyism? Okay, that was the idea of accusing others of wrongdoing for your own gain, or the idea of going on a witch hunt. So Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, my home state, I'm not real proud of that, but he's still interesting. I did my sophomore paper in college on him. And he accused people of being communists because people are afraid of being communists or of having communists in the country. And that kind of gave him a ride to fame. How did Rosa Parks help begin the civil rights movement? Well, she didn't plan to do what she did, but she was asked to give up her seat to a white person and she refused. And that kind of started the spark of, of change without using violence. How did roads improve in the 1950s? That's where they built a lot of highways. Number 5, how did the Russians start the space race? So they launched Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2. And basically those are satellites, and then the second one had a dog on it. Okay, so that's about it for this section. I'm sorry I had to read kind of fast. I don't like to make the videos too long. So good to see ya, or see me.